Good afternoon. My name is Liga, and together with Robin, Anik, Sujo, Bob, and Jed, we are group number 6, and today we'll be looking at the problem of traffic congestion. More specifically, we'll explore how changes in current policy of Highway Trust Fund, which funds transportation infrastructure and mass transit, could potentially improve its ability to solve traffic congestion.
Broad transportation policy issues. Traffic congestion in large U.S. cities is no secret. While larger populations are naturally congested in urban areas, we are now experiencing higher incidents of congestion in more suburban areas. As the U.S. infrastructure ages, without regular maintenance and upkeep, we are increasingly identifying significant deterioration and safety issues among our roads and bridges. Broad-based options for mass transit are usually located only within certain boundaries and don't adequately address geographic populations. There is also an equitability issue with the distribution of these options. As more roads are constructed or widened, this causes a natural emissions increase with the ability to handle increased motor traffic, along with an increase in runoff into the water supplies and then the overall impact with less green space. There is a need for additional sources for moving the ever-increasing freight traffic, which supplies America's demand for goods and services. And then there are also options regarding funding with private enterprise for new construction and maintenance. The Highway Trust Fund. This fund was established in 1956 to provide a steady source of funding for the interstate highway system. It is comprised of two principal subfunds: the highway account, which is largely devoted to construction and maintenance of highways and bridges, and the mass transit account, which is used to make capital or capital-related expenditures on buses, rail, subways, ferries, and other modes of public mass transit. This was created as a user-supported fund, which means that the taxes for the Highway Trust Fund were paid by the users of the highways themselves. The authority to tax and expend has expiration dates assigned to them, and they must be periodically extended by Congress. Spending on surface transportation generally comes from state and local government. They also have federal grants and direct contributions, which both are supported by the Highway Trust Fund. Sources of funding. The CBO authorizes general fund transfers to the Highway Trust Fund, predominantly with excise taxes on motor fuel. This makes up 63% of the total revenues collected. The diesel tax makes up 24% of the total revenues. Truck and trailer sales tax, which makes up 9% of the total revenues. The vehicle tax, which makes up 3% of the total revenues. And the truck tire tax, which makes up 1% of the total revenues for the Highway Trust Fund. With regard to the balance of the Highway Trust Fund, there is a balance gap that the CBO projects an imbalance of $121 billion between the years 2021 and 2026. The short-term measures in place will only cover the imbalance until the year 2020. There are possibilities of decreasing or cutting payments to state and local governments and transferring general revenue into the Highway Trust Fund.
Problem statement. As previously described, the Highway Trust Fund was established to solve many problems. The U.S. Department of Transportation is responsible for implementing transportation policy made by Congress through the administration of surface transportation programs at the federal level. These surface transportation programs and projects are aimed at keeping our transportation network in good repair through infrastructure improvements, maintenance, building capacity, and reducing congestion, while also increasing the multimodal mass capacity of cities and states. With such varying needs and functions, the revenue of the fund is starving and cannot sufficiently cover needs of all areas in the Highway Trust Fund. To concisely state the issue, the revenue of the Highway Trust Fund is unable to meet all the needs specified and simply cannot meet the demands of our growing population. This analysis will explore policy recommendations for the Highway Trust Fund, specifically addressing traffic congestion. As the U.S. population grows in metropolitans across the nation, so does transportation demand. However, building roads is a slow and expensive process that has resulted in an imbalance of transportation supply and demand in the U.S. Using simplistic analysis of the economic theory of supply and demand, we can further understand traffic congestion. As you can see in the chart, congestion across all metropolitan cities in the United States is growing and becoming a larger concern. The basic economic theory of supply and demand says that these two forces set the market price for a good. We can adapt this theory to show that the supply of highways becomes unmatched for the demand of commuters, and public transportation needs are left unmet. Since the market force in this analysis is the spending and the tax revenue received, the federal government should use this information to set the allocation for this good as a stand-in for market price in the standard supply and demand model. The result of this analysis is an imbalance and is clearly something that needs to be addressed.
As already mentioned, the Highway Trust Fund is short on funds. One of the main reasons is that the motor vehicle fuel taxes, the main source of revenue for the fund, have not been increased for over 2 decades, and they are not pegged to inflation. As a result, over time, the purchasing power of the revenue has decreased by estimated 40% compared to 1993 when the federal gas tax was last raised. One of the solutions to the traffic congestion is pegging motor vehicle fuel tax to inflation. This solution would bring in additional money for building new roads and developing mass transit. Increasing the motor vehicle tax by a penny provides approximately $1.3 billion of additional revenue for Highway Trust Fund. And as you can see here on the slide, the revenue expenditure gap would be closed by increasing the tax by 10 pennies per gallon. Adjusting the tax for inflation to current year, which is an increase of roughly 15 cents, and pegging it to future inflation would provide continuous additional funds that could be used both toward building new roads and improving the mass transit to help deal with congestion. Calculations have been made to better understand the impact that the increase in fuel tax would have on an average driver and an average household. With current fuel tax rates, as you can see here on the slide, an average of $96.42 per vehicle and an average of $168.73 per household is paid in federal fuel taxes. Increasing the tax by 10 cents, ensuring Highway Trust Fund gets balanced, would increase the average amount paid per vehicle by $52.4 for a total of $148.82, and per household by $91.71 for a total of $260.44. And adjusting the fuel tax to inflation would increase the amount paid per vehicle by $78.6 for a total of $172.02, and per household by $137.57 for a total of $306.3.
Alternative solutions to combat traffic congestion would be to maximize the funding, of which 25% is supplied through the Highway Trust Fund. Allocations currently include distribution to programs that do not support reductions in traffic congestion, including federal programs. Mass transit receives 1/5 of the allocation, however utilized by less than 7% of commuters limited to urban areas in contrast to suburban areas. The fuel tax that funds the Highway Trust Fund has remained constant over the past 2 decades and has played a role in decreasing consumer anxiety. However, this perception may change with the recommendation of raising the fuel tax in order to generate more funding, along with the discontinuation of federal programs, which removes the federal government out of the equation for addressing local issues in which they serve no purpose, as the issues regarding traffic congestion are better known on the local level than nationally. also with redirection of programs to actually stimulate a reduction in traffic congestion. In addition to decreasing modifications of the percentages the Highway Trust Fund allocates to mass transit, maintenance, and highway expansion, with mass transit receiving a deduction and increasing the percentage allocated to highway expansion and maintenance, which according to the ACE Infrastructure Report Card, the original intent for maintenance was to be supported by the states and local governments. Consequently, with these alternative solutions, the Highway Trust Fund can more effectively provide funding for deferred projects and road expansion, acquiring safer roads and bridges that require less maintenance than the current plan, resulting in a reduction in traffic congestion.
Selection of policy analysis criteria is typically the second step in the policy analysis process following problem identification. In evaluating the Highway Trust Fund for its ability to better address traffic congestion in urbanized areas, we chose 3 criteria to consider. They are fund efficiency, social equity, and environmental sustainability. Fund efficiency speaks to the policy alternative's ability to stabilize the fund over time. That is, to not run a deficit of funds in versus funds out. Social equity speaks to the ability of a policy alternative to better provide equal transportation access to all individuals regardless of income, while still solving for congestion improvements. And finally, the environmental sustainability criteria speaks to the ability of the policy alternative to solve for the environmental externalities of traffic congestion, negative externalities such as air pollution. These criteria meet the 5 meta criteria as described in the Analyzing Policy text by Michael Munger, which are that criteria should focus on ends, not means, that criteria should be clearly stated and be measurable, that criteria have quantifiable trade-offs that can be defined, and that the criteria are complete with regards to addressing the concerns of citizens, and finally be mutually exclusive in addressing different aspects of the policy problem. A simple weighted criteria alternative matrix was used to evaluate policy change alternatives. The Criteria Alternatives Matrix is a way to organize and compare criteria and allows for judging the performance of alternatives in satisfying different criteria. It is important to note that in a real-world policy analysis process, the criteria and weights would be determined by involving the main transportation policy domain actors in the process. Hypothetically, for this example then, we assume the criteria and associated weights were determined early in the analysis process by actors convened by the United States Secretary of Transportation, and which included elected officials, interested citizens, government agency staff, and representatives from various transportation advocacy groups. An overview of the trade-offs considered with each alternative is as follows. So we have 3 alternatives. The first one is increasing the motor fuel tax, and the other 2 are altering the focus of the spending away from the current 75% focus on roads and road maintenance and 25% focus on mass transit and other modes to alternative 2, which is a reversal of that, 75% on mass transit and other modes and only 25% on roads and road maintenance, and then a 50-50 split to those 2 things. So back to the increase in motor fuel tax. According to a 2015 report by the American Association of State and Transportation Highway Officials, AASHTO, the pros of a tax increase include a large revenue yield and ease of administration. The cons include concerns with long-term sustainability and strong opposition to raising taxes generally and the somewhat regressive nature of the tax. However, with regard to addressing traffic congestion, the current amount of funding is not solving the problem, so the assumption is that more funding, even with the current allocation of 75% to roads and road maintenance and 25% to mass transit and other modes, that more money at the situation would yield an improvement to traffic congestion. Moving on to the next two alternatives. First, we'll look at both of them is looking to pull more funding to mass transit and other modes. It's just a question of how aggressively. So these two alternatives are based on the need to shift the transportation network away from the predominant single occupancy vehicle network to a more balanced transportation network, which contains many transportation systems that work well and provide choices for people. Continued investment in predominantly road and single occupancy vehicle transportation infrastructure perpetuates current non-sustainable land use transportation patterns. The strong incentives over the last century for the expansion of road transportation by providing high levels of transportation supply in the form of highways has created a vicious circle of congestion which supports the construction of additional road capacity and automobile dependency. However, the cons of the reversal alternative, that is focusing 75% of the funds on mass transit and other modes, the cons include the predominant motor vehicle oriented land use patterns in the U.S. and the predominant need for motor vehicle use for access to jobs and other basic needs or opportunities, and the slowness in which all of this will change to allow for transportation systems and land use patterns that can lower motor vehicle miles traveled and therefore chip away at and improve traffic congestion. Clearly, an incremental approach, such as our last policy change alternative, which is looking at a 50-50 split of the highway trust fund for roads and mass transit and other systems equally. This is needed. The incremental approach is needed due to the inherent incremental and slow change to a less car-dependent land use pattern in the United States. Over the last 50 years, land development has been predominantly on the urban or suburban fringe, and this growth has often been characterized or is characterized by low-density, separated and dispersed uses that are dependent on automobiles. So it's safe to assume that reversing automobile-dependent land use trends, which accelerated in the 1950s, will take at least that same amount of time to reverse. So, it may be better to take an incremental approach to changing the funding so that the land use and the transportation supply systems can evolve at the same rate, so as to not create a mismatch of transportation need with what type of systems are out there. Before getting to our recommendation, it is important to do a organizational and political scan of the policy environment. After review of the results, we took a political and organizational scan and looked for constraints. We did this by taking a top-down and bottom-up scanning approach to the policy implementation environment. A top-down approach considers the goals of the highest level policy designers and traces the design through the lowest level. And a bottoms-up approach considers the abilities and motivation of the lowest level implementers. From a top-down perspective, raising taxes are not popular policy for decision makers. And from a bottoms-up perspective, frontline agency employees responsible for design and implementation of transportation projects may shirk responsibilities and not work as hard if they don't agree with the new non-road, non-car focused policy.
There is little doubt that the Highway Trust Fund, as it's currently funded and allocated, is incapable of meeting the future needs of the continuing urban congestion issue in American cities. Despite new technologies and increased use of mass transit in urban areas, use of roadways as the primary transportation option for commuters and travelers is likely to continue to grow. Urban productivity will continue to rely on the efficiency of roadways to meet distribution needs, all the while dealing with the problems accompanied by increased use and decreased funding for maintenance and repairs. However, popular sentiment will continue to move toward mass transit and other alternative solutions to traffic congestion that are both lower cost to the consumer and are more reliable. Additionally, as one analyzes the presented alternatives, it is important to remember political and organizational constraints, especially those created from public demand. As we have reviewed in our earlier analysis, each option has benefits and disadvantages, as we've listed here. Although any alternative funding of the Highway Trust Fund presents efficiency problems, there must be some change in the allocation of funding in conjunction with increased appropriation to the Highway Trust Fund to meet congestion needs and the long-term sustainability needs solved through mass transit. A reallocation of funding that weighs each evenly, while not ideal using the weighted criteria alternative matrix, presents the best option when considering organizational and political constraints. Additionally, this incremental change toward more mass transit funding will allow for future adjustments as the policy is continually reviewed as needs change. As such, our recommendation is that the Highway Trust Fund funding be reallocated in this manner. Recently, considerable attention has been placed on the conversion of the motor fuel tax to a per-mile use tax or vehicle miles of travel tax, or VMT. Led by states such as Oregon, pilot studies for testing the implementation of a VMT have made progress in moving towards this tax alternative. However, the VMT still has many technical issues to work through. Regardless, the implementation of a VMT would most likely be a long process, as policymakers decide the best methods to affect the tax, and would be 5 or 10 years in the future. While the VMT could be a viable alternative in the future, it is not an option at this time, but should be considered for future research and analysis.